All right, so study 3. Good morning, Monashi Mountaineers. Very nice to see you all this morning. We've been talking about those fears that loom giant-like in our lives. Those fears that are no more or less real than the dangerous giant that Moses faced, Og. No more or less formidable than Goliath when faced by David. We've been talking about those fears that stalk our nights, that grow larger in the dark. In Moses' case, I think one of the fears, one of the giants that loomed in his life was the impact of old age. In David's life, it was fear itself and having to stand up when no one else would. But both faced the weight of peer pressure and a whole nation's collected, concentrated fear resting on their shoulders alone. And what we want to consider today is a man who faced a terrible choice. And it appears this man was willing to stand up to the greatest giant in history. The biggest, the toughest, the meanest of them all. You see, all of the giants, as far as we can tell, trace their lineage back to the dead giants before the flood. Oh yes, we know there was no genetic connection there, but nonetheless, they trace themselves back to those giants who died in the catastrophe. And as we considered yesterday, the general term for giants is not a description of giantism at all. That word Repha, in fact, we read it in our daily reading today. They went into the valley of the Rephaim, the undead, the shades of the dead ones, the walking shades of the long dead monsters. The Anakim recounted as the Rephaim. And so people saw in these giants, as it were, a ghost of all that had passed. They were, in their minds, the reanimated corpses of the giants who died in the flood, those Nephilim, the Gibborim, the mighty men of Noah's day. Nimrod stands head and shoulders above all of these, taking his cue also from those mighty giants, those men of renown before the flood. And even though Nimrod has now been dead for 4,000 years, the tower that Nimrod built still casts a long shadow on our world. The kingdom that he established lives on. Its kings are inspired even still by his greatness. And of all the giants, none is so significant. None changed history like Nimrod did. And the man who faced him, the hero of faith who risked isolation and exclusion, hatred, even it seems death, to rebuke this giant, well, he's someone possibly many of us have never heard of. A brother by the name of Eber. Now, Genesis chapter 10, as we had read for us by Brother Dan, it's among those most ancient of records. The text here is threadbare. It's almost Spartan. And some of the detail is no doubt lost. We need to thread together our story today to try and understand what's happening in between the pieces of text. This is a chapter, obviously, that is just after the end of the story of Noah, obviously. It's the what happens next after the flood, the PS, if you like, the coda to the catastrophe that drowned the planet. And while the chapter may seem sometimes like a list of names, it conceals within it the story of these two men, Eber and Nimrod, the hero and the giant. In Genesis chapter 9, you'll remember Noah and the other 7 saved by water leave the ark, and they step into a pristine new world, a world unstained by the crimes of those giants before the Nephilim. But before long, the lessons of the flood are going to be forgotten, or more pointedly, rejected wholesale, as men began to rage against the constraints of a life of faith and service and chafe against the life lived under the rainbow. And that last phrase I said just there may seem a little bit strange. To chafe against the life lived under the rainbow. The rainbow was given in Genesis chapter 9 to mark God's solemn covenant never again to destroy all the earth with a flood. It was a beautiful symbol, wasn't it? And still is. A beautiful symbol of an eternal promise of divine care. And yet it seems that to many it had become a symbol of God's watchful eye. And if you'll forgive this piece of contemporary referencing, a little bit like this. People would have felt that each time the clouds built up and the rain fell, they would feel threatened and fearful. They would worry that perhaps, maybe the rain would not stop once again. And then each time they saw the rainbow, they would be grudgingly compelled to live a life they did not want to live, lest those clouds come again in anger. They wanted to live the lives that they wanted to live, and yet they were threatened by this vast, multi-hued eye in the sky that seemed always to be watching them, to be commanding them to do things the way God wanted them done. And we actually know that this is the way they felt, because across the globe, the legends still linger. There, deep in racial memories around the world, are stories of how people felt at this period. The Hondurans, for example, see the rainbow as a symbol of the devil's anger. There are Amazonian tribes who close their mouths when they see a rainbow, lest malign spirits enter into them. The Karens of Burma, for example, see the rainbow as a symbol of impending evil from the king of hell. They see it as a time when the Lord of the heavens is enraged. And their ancient legends, even though they are confused, they are still memories of the flood and of their fear that God might judge again. And in many of these stories, we can feel the tone of oppression. We can feel that sense that they had, that they saw God as angry and as vindictive. Perhaps the clearest I've come across is this one from the Pacific Islands. They have this legend of a time in which the sky was very low, so low that all the inhabitants of the islands were forced to crawl underneath this low sky. But at a period of time, along came a champion, a hero who by dint of prodigious effort was able to lift the sky up a little so that he could walk on his knees, and then a little bit higher so he could carry it on his shoulders, and then finally, by dint of prodigious effort, was able to lift the sky up above the highest tree. And for this effort, he was deified. He was made into a god. And they called this hero who lifted the skies away from them the elevator of the heavens. Can you hear that? Buried in this story, buried in these old legends, memories of the races. There are fragments of the flood, aren't there? Fragments of this idea of God as an oppressive, angry, vengeful God, weighing them down like a low-hanging sky, and of the elevator of the heavens, Nimrod, the man who pushed God away. In fact, Genesis chapter 10 gives us a very clear idea of this too. Because you see, Genesis chapter 10 records the names, the descendants of Noah. It's got his children, it's got his grandchildren, and so on, so on, so on, so on. Whose son was who and where they ended up, the lineage of the nations. And among these, of course, there were some who kept walking with God, while there were others who wanted to walk away, who wanted to be freed from God. There's a chapter full of lots of names and places. There's an interesting thing buried in these names. Because you see, of only 2 names are we given anything more than just names. Here's a chapter full of names, but there's only 2 characters about which we get any further history inside the chapter. And in both instances, the ancestor, the patriarch of their family line, is distinguished by their descendants rather than the opposite way around. Have a look at verse 8. It says, "And Cush begat Nimrod." He began to be a mighty hunter. Cush begat Nimrod. Except Cush didn't beget Nimrod. The sons of Cush are clearly listed in verse 7. The sons of Cush: Sheba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, Sabdeka, sons of Rama, Sheba and Dedan. No Nimrod. Nimrod's not there. Because, see, the word begat in verse 8 is, this is a little bit technical, but is in the Kal stem as opposed to the Hifil stem. Now, that means nothing to me. It may mean something to you. But basically what that does mean is it changes the meaning of the word. And when it's in the Hifil stem, the stem it's not in this verse, it speaks of actual paternity. Whose father? Whereas here in this verse, it speaks not of paternity, but of lineage. It's telling us that Nimrod wasn't the son of Cush. No, he was in the line of Cush. Or more to the point, the line of Cush became distinctive, for in it arose Nimrod, the giant of this age. And we'll see a very similar thing when we get to Eber. The line, Cush, is made famous by his descendant rather than the other way around. Nimrod, as we know, was the descendant of Ham. Ham was the father of the African races, and in fact, Cush means black, and a lot has been made of that over the years for good and for bad. We're told that this man, verse 8, began to be a mighty hunter. That might be better translated slightly differently. So most of you will have a Bible that improves upon that. The ESV, the RSV, the Jerusalem Bible, and many others put it this way: he was the first on earth to be a mighty man, a mighty one. Oh, is that good or bad? Is it good or bad to be a mighty one? Well, we don't have to be in any doubt, because It's placed here in Genesis chapter 10. It's very, very early in the biblical record. And so if we're looking for a precedent, if we're trying to say to ourselves, all right, so where is the precedent? So if we can work out whether being a mighty one here is good or bad, there is only one precedent so far in the record that Moses had available for him to draw upon. The last time a mighty one was mentioned in the record, and we've already been here, was Genesis 6, verse 4. This is the only precedent Moses has so far for mighty ones. It's the same phrase that is used to describe these mighty giants, the Nephilim, who fell during the flood. It's that phrase there, the mighty heroes of old, Ha-Gibborim, the mighty ones, Nephilim. And so here in Noah's new world is the first of an old breed of mighty, godless men. We're being told here that Nimrod was the first to replicate the spirit, the thinking, and the behavior of those mighty giants who had died before the flood. In verse 9, we're told that he was more than a mighty man. It says, he was a mighty hunter before God. Wherefore it is said, become proverbial, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before God. So he was more than a mighty man. We're being told here that he was a powerful man of influence due to his prowess as a hunter. In fact, not just any hunter, he was a mighty hunter. Now, I need to be very careful amongst this audience, and this is not something I would have to say in Australia. I don't have anything against hunters. Not the surname and not the pastime. But that said, there is something about hunters in the Bible. We might say in Australia anyway that being a hunter is not a particularly politically correct career choice. It wouldn't be in Australia, but look, it's not a real problem. There's not a moral issue there. Do you know in the Bible there's not one positive example of hunters? And again, I'm not making a point about the pastime. But biblically, you think of the hunters you know, they're never good. But this man wasn't just a hunter. He was a mighty hunter. You might think to yourself, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between a hunter and a mighty hunter? Well, the difference is, and any hunter will tell you this, it's about the prey. It's about the prey that you pursue. A mighty hunter is capable of bringing down the wiliest, the most unpredictable, the mightiest of prey, the most savage, the most brutally intelligent of beasts. Which is the greatest and the mightiest predator? The one right at the top of the food chain? Man. Man. And the root word here for hunt almost exclusively refers to those that hunt human prey. Clearly this was the case here, for it was by hunting that his kingdom was established. His ability as a mighty hunter is what built his mighty empire. The Hebrew here is describing the fact that his hunting and his kingdom were cause and effect. Such a mighty hunter was he that people living in Moses' time, 1,000 years later on, remembered his exploits, and they had become proverbial, like Nimrod, like the mighty hunter before God. before God. In the face of God, the Hebrew literally means. And to be in the face of God, it's not in a good way. That's not a good thing. It's saying to us that Nimrod got in God's face. Now, I don't know if you have that phrase here. You do? To get in someone's face, to get up in their face, that's what it's saying of Nimrod. Much the way that Korah got in Moses' face. That phrase that I've highlighted and read where it says, and they rose up before Moses, in the face of Moses. And Korah and Dathan and Abiram were up in Moses' face. The Septuagint Bible has it this way, that he was a mighty hunter against the Lord. He's a mighty hunter in a bad way, a hunter of men, and almost every single dictionary agrees on this fact, that his name, and the Bible names are significant, his name, Nimrod, means rebellion, or we will rebel. Was he just a causeless rebel, a James Dean-like figure, a nonconformist out to have fun? No, this man was a rebel against God himself. Here's what Keelan Delitzsch, one of the most studied Bible commentaries, says. The name itself, Nimrod, comes from the Hebrew, we will revolt, and it points to some violent resistance to God. It is so characteristic that it can only have been given to him by his contemporaries and thus become a proper name. They're telling us that this is not the name he was born with. He was probably called something like Craig or Jeff. But by the end of his life, they called him the one who rebelled against God. And so here we go. Here's the 12-cubit question. Was Nimrod a giant? Well, clearly he was a man gifted with considerable physical prowess, wasn't he? Prowess that enabled him to build a kingdom around his personal might. And as we've already noted, he began to be a mighty man, a Har-Gibborim, a hero of the world. This word is used both of the Nephilim in Genesis 6 verse 4 and, by the way, of Goliath in 1 Samuel 17, but it's also used of many other mighty men, non-giant mighty men in the Bible. So the fact that he's called a mighty man does not mean he's a giant. The Septuagint version translates verse 8 this way. And Cush, begat Nimrod, well, that's Nimrod, he began to be a giant in the earth. To my mind, that's not compelling proof that he was. The fact that a much later Greek translation inserts the word giant in there doesn't make it compelling that he was a physical giant, but I think we can safely say, even if he was not born a giant, he became one. Firstly, in the eyes of his contemporaries, he became the biggest, the most important man, a titan in politics and religion and warfare, much like the giants of industry today. He became an Elon Musk, a Trump, if you like, who towered above all before them in both their hubris and in their ability to turn the world upside down. He was a man who cast a long shadow, and he built an empire that lasts till our era, and, well, it will last beyond. But secondly, in verse 8, we were told that he was the first on earth to be a mighty one. Now, clearly, it does not mean first in sense of time, because, well, the Nephilim had already been mighty ones. It's not saying he was the first ever. No, it's telling us he was the first in rank. He was the one who became the top-ranked mighty one. If you had a leaderboard of violent giants of history, he'd be at the top. The first on the leaderboard of dictators and strongmen. In fact, the ancient memory of Nimrod and the stories that surrounded him were copied into many other cultures and races, including, for example, the Greeks. The Greeks renamed Nimrod and used the character of Orion to describe him. Orion has given his name to the star system that we can see at night. But the Aeneid by Virgil talks about tall Orion stalking over the flood and describes him as a giant. Orion is mentioned in the oldest of Greek literature, dating back to 800 BC. He's pictured as a giant followed by hunting hounds, a giant hunter. And in Arabic literature, he appears with a new name. The constellation of Orion in the heavens is called Al-Jabbar, which means the giant. And so Nimrod may not physically have been a giant like Og or Goliath, but in ambition and in achievement and in ungodly empire building, he towers above all of them. Now, verse 10 tells us that the start of his empire was Babel. And the story of how that empire started will be recorded in Genesis chapter 11. It's an empire that started through his accomplishments as a manhunter, a rebel, and a man of renown. He was accomplished in three main fields of endeavor: in the military as a hunter of men, in the religious as a rebel against God, and in the political as the first hero of humanity, the one on the leaderboard of those who stood for his fellow men. He started his kingdom with Babylon, the gate of God, as it means in Babylonian. But that wasn't the end of his empire building. Verse 11, out of that land he went forth Asher, and he builded Nineveh and the city of Rehoboth and Calais and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, the same as a great city. In other words, from there, from Babylon, the gate of God, he went out to a land that would later be called Assyria, and he built Nineveh. And the next few verses in the Hebrew are quite hard to parse, but better commentators suggest to us that it should be read that Nineveh, which is a most vast city. He went and built Nineveh, which is a most vast city. In fact, he built several other cities, but his epitaph here is that he built Rezin, which was between Nineveh, and Calais, all of which combined to form a super city, that great city known as Nineveh. And it wasn't a great city. No, this man built Babylon, and when that project was stopped by God, he built the great city. A city made of three parts: Rezin, Calais, and Nineveh. And 4,000 years later, what Nimrod started with Nineveh and Babylon, 4,000 years later, after today, finally that city will fall. He built an empire that still stands. What a giant. Genesis chapter 11, let's go there now, tells us the story of the building of Babel. And while it's clear that there were lots of people involved in the building of Babel, it was a bit of a team project for humanity, really. Genesis chapter 10 confirms to us that Nimrod was the architect of Babylon. Nimrod was the real thought leader who guided, who inspired, who motivated the construction of the Tower of Babel. Verse 4 says that they said, go to. So Genesis 11, verse 4, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So there were several goals in building this tower in Babel, in the gate of God. Firstly, they wanted to reach heaven. What was that about? Oh, they wanted to wrest control over their lives away from the God of the rainbow. They wanted to let a man stand in the heavens and advocate for them against God, to take God on in his own domain. And you will note, if you've got a King James Bible, that phrase where it says, whose top may reach unto heaven, that phrase may reach is in italics, which of course means to us it's not in the original, it's supplied, it's an insertion. And so this sentence could read, a tower whose top is heaven. Well, the Tower of Babel was called the Gate of Heaven, and it suggested that its top was adorned with the horoscope, man's attempt to predict and control his destiny using the stars. I'm sure you have them in your newspapers here. You know, Aries is rising today in the house of Mars. It is not a good day for you to purchase a sandwich. That sort of thing, you know, very strong, meaningful. And so at the top of this tower would have been these symbols that would give them this sense of control, the ability to manipulate their own destiny using their stars and the prowess they had of interpreting them. Whatever it was, whatever this tower did, whatever it meant when it said, whose top is the heaven, Nimrod clearly planned to dethrone God. The other goal they had, it says there, was to make us a name. And the Hebrew of that word name, as many of you will know, is the word Shem. And I think this is the biblical version of a Freudian slip. Nimrod planned to replace Shem. Shem was the priest of the Most High God. And what Nimrod wanted to do was remove Shem from that role as the mediator between God and man, and to enthrone himself on high, to establish himself as both high priest and deity in one. In other words, to replace the God of the rainbow with a God they understood, who would let them live how they wanted to live. Josephus wrote this of Nimrod. He said, he persuaded them not to ascribe it to God, but to believe it was their own courage which procured their happiness. It was their own courage which procured their happiness. Nimrod, though a godless tyrant, promoted the fiction that happiness is something that we can achieve. That happiness is gotten through what we do. It's not due to God's goodness, oh no, it's our own efforts. And sometimes, at least at home, I hear the language of Nimrod in the ecclesia, and it scares me. People will say things like, I want to live my best life. I want to be my best self. It's a digression, I know, but I think this is important. Would you mind flicking across quickly to Colossians 3? I personally, this might not work for you, but I personally find this passage incredibly powerful. Colossians 3, verse 2. Where the apostle says to us, set your affection, your mind, on things above, not on things on the earth, for you are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. What does he mean? Well, he interprets, when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall ye also appear with him in glory. The point of this is, brothers and sisters, right now we don't have a life. We don't have a best self. There isn't a me. We are dead. And Christ, who is our life, will appear. And so if someone says to you at some point along the line, what is with this obsession with your church, with your community, with going to all of these things, with allowing yourself to get worn down with service? You don't have a life. The answer is, too right. Christ is my life. And when he shall appear, we'll appear with him in glory. But Nimrod said, you'll be happy when? You'll be happy when you get rich. You'll be happy when you lose 5 kilograms. You'll be happy when you find yourself. You'll be happy when you get your degree. You'll be happy when you finish this tower. And he promoted this focus on self, this very modern perspective of self-empowerment and glorification. And here we have a giant of humanity devoted to banishing God, to empowering sinners, and to glorifying self, who set up a system of government and of society that today, well, in Australia, and I'm sure it's the same here too, fills our world completely. And we're almost out of time, and I haven't mentioned the hero. So let's talk about him. So what of Eber? Well, Eber first shows up in chapter 10 and verse 21. Genesis 10 verse 21, where it says, unto Shem, the high priest, priest of the Most High God, unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder, even unto him were children born, the children of Shem, Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, Aram, the children of Aram, so on, so on, so on. So, I don't know if you can notice, but the same thing that we saw with Cush, where Cush, the ancestor, we're told, oh, Cush is famous because, you know, Cush, he was Nimrod's ancestor. Oh, Nimrod's ancestor, that Cush. I thought you meant the other Cush. Well, it's the same here. Shem here is distinguished from all of the other Shems out there because he was the one who was the ancestor of Eber. So who was this Eber? And what did he do that was so important? And why is he mentioned here out of sequence in history? He's not going to be born till way down in verse 24. He's the great grandson of Shem. What makes him more important than Salah or Arphaxad? Well, we're told in verse 25 that unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. 2 sons. He named one of them Peleg, which means to split, or division, or even an earthquake. For it appears that soon after this little boy was born, an event tore the world apart. An event so significant and dramatic that Eber named his son after this event. There was a violent division of the world after the events at Babel, when God confused humanity and he introduced the babel of competing languages overnight. Its name was called Babel, because there God confused the language of all the earth. And Eber named his son after that event. Well, I don't know about you, but just naming your son hardly qualifies as an event worthy of attention, and specifically the attention given here to Eber. I mean, I don't know that I'm going to get famous for the naming of my children. So what? Is that enough? Is that what he is? He just named him. Well, I think there's a clue here in the name Eber. All of these names are significant. They all relate to the events that surrounded them. And presumably they were all named by their contemporaries or by Moses to signify the roles that they played. Eber's name means beyond, or to be over the other side, to cross over to the other side. And I think this is what Eber did that was of significance, that made him worthy of notice. Eber's name is all about sides, and this man picked a side. He picked the other side. That's what his name means. Other side to who? I think that's obvious, isn't it? We spent the whole morning working to this. Nimrod, of course. In the face of a violent man, a hunting, godless rebel, a man who had the whole world in the palm of his hand, Eber publicly chose the other side. And it appears that he did this completely alone. Chapter 11, verse 1, the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. It almost appears like everybody was on board with Nimrod's God replacement scheme. There were brochures being handed out on street corners. Sign the petition to get rid of God, and everybody was signing it. They had one language and one speech, and you think to yourself, well, that means the same thing. Why does it repeat itself? They had one language, they had one language. But they're not the same. What we're being told here is a very important detail. Speech refers to thought process. It's the subjects that we communicate. And so what we're being told is that the whole world had one language and one way of thinking about things, one mind. So much so that in verse 6, God says, the people is one. There was one plan to build Babel, a gateway for the new God to enter in. One plan. And everybody was on board but Eber. He made a stand. He crossed over. He made that choice so publicly, so obviously, and it was so clearly articulated that it changed everybody's memory of him. No one ever remembered him the same way ever again, and the only thing they remembered about him was he was the one who chose the other side. Oh, Eber, that's right. He's the one who stood up to Nimrod. In fact, his stand was so significant that when Moses wrote the record of the children of Shem, 9 generations, thousands, even tens of thousands of descendants, of all of those descendants, the one that Moses flagged as the best reflection of the character of Shem's family, the mascot of the family of Shem, the blessed of Yahweh, It was Eber, the one who changed sides and left Team Nimrod. That's what it's telling us. This is that Shem who was the father of Eber. It's hard, brothers and sisters, to stand in a world that proclaims tolerance and openness to any truth, any choice, any lifestyle that declares these things. This tolerance is the highest virtue. It's not, is it, brothers and sisters? It's not the highest virtue. It is instead the virtue of a giant who strove to depose God. And when we stand for God's values, what we're doing is we're choosing the other side. We are declaring that God is the only God, and we are setting him in our heavens again. That's what Eber did. And I want us to realize what a terrifying giant of a choice this was. All of the world, the whole planet was one. That's what God said. It's not an assessment of Moses. The angels said that. They all were marching in rank, as it were, behind Nimrod. This was not a stand that could be overlooked in an age of general nonconformity. It's not like the decision we might make to have your own spinning wheel in the age of, stores that sell fabric and home craftsware. It's not like the decision to wash your own dishes when someone's already invented a dishwasher. It's not that. No, Eber's stand was incredibly risky. It was one of those stands that risked everything. It wasn't even a stand, sometimes we have these figures who will make a stand that is career limiting, but it's not life threatening. No, what Eber did was said no to a merciless hunter of men, a giant of divine rebellion, a man so violent and powerful that thousands of years later, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, even the Pacific Islanders remembered him as a giant hunter. This would be a little bit more like standing up to Mr. Putin, knowing that your next step would likely be off the 9th floor balcony. The fear of standing alone is what Eber faced. Completely, terrifyingly alone. Sin in giant form threatened that fragile thread of the truth, and only Eber crossed over. And because of this act of faithful courage, Shem, the mighty priest of God, became famous because he was the ancestor of Eber's children. He was the ancestor of the one who separated himself from the whole world. And who were those children? Well, here we go. Abram is called the Hebrew. I don't know if you've ever done this. Have you ever looked up the word Hebrew in your Bible dictionary? Here's what it says. An Eberite, that is, a descendant of Eber. And why was Abraham a true child of Eber and Eberu? Well, we know why. He separated himself from Ur of the Chaldees and all that it stood for, and he crossed over. on his own. Here's another one. There's not many. Joseph, a Hebrew. And why was he an Hebrew? Well, because he separated himself from his brother's sins. He chose the other side, the other way. Here's another. In fact, the last recorded and so named in the scripture. Jonah. He said to them, I am an Hebrew. Why did he say that? Been hundreds of years in the records that someone has used that term. Chronologically, the last time before Jonah that someone had called themselves an Hebrew, David was not yet king. Why does he use it now? Well, because he's on his way to the great city, the home of Nimrod, who stand against it once more. And we've got one last one. One who truly crossed over, who picked the other side, who stood utterly alone against the giants of sin and death. And it's this one. It's this descendant of Shem who will finally defeat history's greatest giant. Come across to Micah 5, our final passage. Micah 5, verse 1 and 2. Closely watching the time, where I have 1 minute to get this done in the nicest possible way. Micah 5, verse 1 and 2. We know this passage. Now gather thyself in troops, O daughter of troops. He's laid siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with the rod upon the tree. But thou, Bethlehem, Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, out of thee shall come he that shall come forth unto me, that is to be the ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, even from everlasting. We know who this speaks of. It's our Messiah. Verse 4, and he shall stand and feed in the strength of Yahweh, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall abide, for now shall he be great in the ends of the earth. In the kingdom our King will be great, and this man shall be the peace. When the Assyrian, the kingdom built by Nimrod, shall come into our land, when that Assyrian will tread in our palaces, then shall we raise against the Assyrian 7 shepherds and 8 principal men, and they, our shepherds, shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod in the entrances thereof. Thus shall our King deliver us from Nimrod's kingdom, when Nimrod comes into our land and when he treads in our borders. And as we wait for our King and our champion, brothers and sisters, in a world that is increasingly filled with Nimrod's thoughts, we need that courage to stand, if necessary, alone. And we absolutely have to choose a side.